Finally, for this week's lecture and practice and policy considerations in family violence, we're going to look at some of the special populations that we've touched on in earlier chapters during this semester, and once again just some considering some policy and practice special considerations for each of those populations. This will be a short lecture as well. First of all, when we look at cross-cultural practice, generally speaking, what we're talking about is a global perspective, family violence around the world. Not only now, it certainly does include also cultures within our own society, but here I believe that the authors are talking about cross-cultural considerations around the globe. And if you look in the chapter, there are some specifics about different cultures and countries. In particular, there's certain issues going on that I'm not going to go into in this lecture, but things like in Egypt and Iran and those things that may be of interest to you and to look more closely at. But there is the authors point out to these different kinds of ways of thinking. Contexts for thinking is what they refer to it as regards to interpersonal violence in a cross-cultural sense, and they have 5 contexts. And first is that male to female intimate partner violence is as a human rights issue. That is a human rights issue around the world. Violence against women is condemned on moral grounds, and patriarchy being the basis of that, and patriarchy reinforced through many institutions in cultures around the world, including religious institutions and educational and social institutions. So first of all, male to female interpersonal intimate partner violence can be considered a human rights issue. Secondly, it can be seen as a legal issue, internationally speaking, that many countries do not see, that should say women is equal to men, not to me, but many countries do not see women as being equal to men, and so let me say this again. When countries see women as equal to men, intimate partner violence decreases, and that's what this slide is trying to tell you, not so eloquently apparently. So as a legal issue, one of the things we can do is to advocate for cultures and nations to begin to look at women's equality and bringing that to standard, because that in and of itself will reduce family violence. As a health problem, the victims of family violence suffer more physical and mental illnesses than non-abused women, and this is certainly true for children as well, and so it can be seen as an international health problem as well, and health caring organizations can address family violence. Economically, as an economic issue, eradicating family violence would reduce a lot of the costs of the various states, the institutions of government and things like that, because of all the problems it does create. And also, conversely, ending poverty, addressing poverty, is also likely to reduce female abuse as well. And finally, as a concern of the state, family violence can also be seen as a concern of government. That the victims need to have more resources and options for safety made available to them through their government, such as shelters and health clinics and those kinds of things. So there's different ways of looking at intimate partner violence around the globe. Policies are needed around the world to address gender-biased beliefs and attitudes that support violence against women. And the interesting thing is that, and this is true in the United States just as much as it is in other cultures, but perhaps more so in other cultures, I guess I would say, that sometimes even women hold anti-woman and patriarchal beliefs every bit as strong, if not even more strongly, than men in some cultures. It isn't a matter of just changing the governments and the judges and courts' perspective on equality, but it also, and it isn't just about changing men's attitude, it's also about changing women's attitudes, that so many of them have been kind of raised and enculturated into this sense that women somehow are less than men. And so strategies around the world and in governments and in societies that promote equality between women and men, improve economic opportunities, and increase rights for women. All of these are really necessary, as well as the efforts to reach out to men and change their attitudes and societal beliefs and attitudes about men and women. When practicing with immigrants and ethnic and racial groups, racial minorities within our culture, or even if you're practicing in other nations, which many of you will do, I'm sure, at one point or another in your career. Cultural competence comes up again here. It's critical for the provider working with any kind of group from a different ethnic or racial or an immigrant group. It's very important to understand the culture and to understand the behaviors that you're treating within the context of that culture. This isn't too surprising that battery intervention program completion is higher when services are provided in the client's language. That's I think is sort of a given, rather than if you're in America and you're working in an Hispanic community, for instance, to provide treatment in Spanish is something that's going to make intervention more effective. That's not surprising, and again, it's not just better. It's any program. This is about cultural competence. That don't expect your clients to understand and to participate in things in English necessarily. Try to provide services to them in their own language. Shelters, women's shelters should expand their own efforts to meet the needs of marginalized groups such as immigrant, ethnic, and women of racial minorities in the neighborhoods. There's different groups have, as we studied a few weeks back, different proclivities to reach out for help. Some of them are mistrustful of police and won't reach out to police. Some will reach out to police, but they're not trustful of social service organizations for varying reasons. Some won't go to shelters because of their cultural beliefs about women's place in the world and their duties to their male partners and things like that. And so shelters really need to kind of reach out, keeping all of these things in mind, and still reach out to those populations and not just kind of exist and wait for people to come to them, because in order to tend to the needs of individuals in these populations, there has to be outreach. There has to be an effort to engage those individuals in many respects. So that really ties into the next bullet point about adapting treatment standards to the different groups and so that we provide policies that are culturally, ethnically appropriate. There are different ideas about men and women. Some cultures really require that you enter the family system by talking with one individual in that family system who's the gatekeeper for the family. And most likely that's a male, and most likely that's all based on patriarchy and some of those things that underlie the battering that may go on. But nonetheless, as you work with these populations, it's important to recognize the kinds of expectations those populations have, so that as you work with them, you're showing some respect for their own cultural demands. The easiest thing for me to think about working in Alaska is the whole idea of eye contact, which in Western Caucasian culture, when somebody looks you in the eye when they're talking with you, it is an indication of that they're listening to you and they're tuned into you. But in many of the Alaska Native cultures, direct eye contact is considered disrespectful, and so we treat, and sometimes culturally inappropriately, insensitively, we may expect Native children to look at us when they're talking with us or when we're talking to them, and view their failure to do so as a disrespect for not really participating in treatment, and so our interventions need to be sensitive to those kinds of cultural issues. But as these authors have said repeatedly, and I have said many times in addition, the basic focus of prevention that is most needed is finding ways to challenge cultural norms that encourage violence against women and promoting their empowerment whenever possible. Now, looking at the issues about battered women in rural settings, um, practitioners working with rural battered women need to understand the culture of rural America, and this seems a bit like stereotyping, and yet, having grown up in a very small town in a very rural section of Pennsylvania in my childhood, I can tell you that all of these things are very true, and probably more so than we run into in urban and suburban areas where there is, I think more of a kind of a liberal and informed stance, so that the church plays a very big role in small communities, and there is a very patriarchal nature to society and the way those rural areas operate. The expectations of genders, boys and girls, and men and women, really are somewhat different in those settings. It's difficult to access medical care. There isn't the kinds of mass transit, or any transit for that matter, sometimes for many of the individuals living in families in rural settings. Shelters certainly don't exist in those small towns, and counseling services is also very limited sometimes. Law enforcement itself is probably stretched thin and may oftentimes cover a very wide area, and so response time can be very slow. So these are all kinds of things when you consider yourself living in, say, a farmhouse, and literally a half a mile away from the nearest farmhouse, and perhaps the nearest state troopers or law enforcement office could be a 45-minute drive away. You're going to be pretty reluctant as a victim to try to contact outside intervention, or to disturb the balance in a family. So these are some extra considerations that rural battered women have to keep as they deal with these issues. And as the text points out, that, and to a certain extent, this is true for any woman leaving the home, and I don't mean to minimize the kinds of things in other situations, but for this woman who has grown up and been raised in a patriarchal home, if she's from a rural area, and those kinds of things, to stand up to this abuse and to leave that home really does change her entire life, and because of the fact that if she does try to get out of this situation and she tries to get a shelter, she may wind up having to leave the area altogether because there just aren't any services around her there. And so leaving home means leaving the community and leaving all that support that she has as well. So, as a policy, we have to look at ways to increase their ability to access services and shelters. We have to be sure that confidentiality is protected, and this is another thing in a small town. Everybody seems to know what's going on, and the people that are checking you in at the counter at the courthouse, perhaps, or who is the receptionist at the counseling center where you're walking in, or wherever it is, maybe your next door neighbor, or the wife of the man who works with the batterer or something like that. And so privacy is something that really doesn't exist quite the same in smaller communities, and so we have to look at ways of increasing and assuring confidentiality so victims can come forward, those kinds of things. And so these are things to consider when looking at battered women in rural settings. And also there are particular problems that kind of feed into the concept of family violence in rural settings, and talk about prevention programs. One of them is the need to confront pornography consumption, and it kind of makes me wonder what they think. They talk about it, this being an issue for both men and for teenage boys, and I don't mean to dismiss this and laugh at this, because it is certainly, pornography consumption for people who think wrongly certainly can set up violence against women. Absolutely, it's objectification of women and all of those kinds of things. But the way the textbook talks about it being a particular problem with teenagers in rural settings, and I wonder if that's any bigger problem for teenagers in rural settings than it is for teenagers anywhere. I don't know what they think boys growing up in rural settings do with their time, but it just kind of made me chuckle, having grown up in a rural setting myself. But there are issues about that, about alcohol consumption, and I think there probably is more use of alcohol in those kinds of settings because there's just less to do in small communities and things. A lot of male peer support for patriarchal, kind of misogynistic kinds of thinking about women. And the whole need to adhere to patriarchal patterns and all this. These are all associated with the sexual assault of rural women, as well as, I think, in many respects, battering as well. So these are things where prevention efforts can be focused. For same-sex intimate partner violence, one of the things is this, that the therapist should who work with these clients should be familiar with gay-friendly resources and try to increase victim empowerment. If you as a therapist aren't sensitive to the dynamics in gay and lesbian relationships, or if you're uncomfortable in dealing with that, you certainly need to be very familiar with where the resources are and refer those people out. Even if you are going to continue to work with that person, to be able to connect them with resources that are established and understanding of their lifestyle is something that can be very reassuring to the client. Lesbians in particular, the text spent some time talking about this, can experience some difficulties, for instance, in accessing shelter services, feeling safe in an ordinary shelter because, we know male batterers aren't going to be allowed into women's shelter, but sometimes female batterers can get in because they're female, and they may disguise, a female batterer could develop a ruse to get into a woman's shelter, so the female victim may feel less secure in the shelter than she might otherwise. Again, working with homosexuals, cultural competence is very much an issue here as well, because there is a culture that exists in same-sex relationships that differs from the culture of many other individuals around them. It's important when you look at the bigger picture here to challenge those homophobic attitudes. And as the text points out, this is going to be kind of like challenging racial discrimination, and so it isn't something that's going to happen easy, and it's very likely that change won't happen until law says it has to happen. So that's why it says you have to start with legal protections for individuals in same-sex relationships. And the text spends some time talking about issues related to same-sex marriage and I think insurance coverage and those kinds of things. I mean, there's a number of different things where the government, I think the legal system is going to have to lead society through this. There's been a lot of talk about changes in attitudes about same-sex relationships over the last 5 or 10 years, and in recent elections, it appears as though the attitudes of the nation are beginning to change. I believe it was somewhere in 2012 that the poll said that over 50% of individuals polled now were in favor of permitting same-sex marriages. So it seems as though society may be turning a corner there, but very much this is a human rights and civil rights issue that's not unlike the issues related to racial discrimination 30 or 40 years ago. Police training and attitudes is another thing that needs some attention there. In same-sex relationships, a lot of times the police fail to recognize that there may still be a batterer and a victim, even though they're both of the same sex, whether male or female. And so don't look at it as a kind of a mutual combat thing, but understand that some of the dynamics, again, setting this up may be different than the more typical male to female in heterosexual relationships, the male to female or female to male intimate partner violence. The dynamics may be different, but still there may be some similarities, and that would include the fact that one person is a batterer, another a victim. Finally, with the military, the last special population this text considers, the particular issues that practitioners need to be aware of, post-traumatic stress and treating PTSD and being competent in treating PTSD, recognizing how that ties into family violence and sometimes very tragic tragic ways because of the fact that individuals in the military have weapons routinely. Women, as we talked about earlier, there is a higher percentage of women who have a child sexual assault history or had some experience with sexual assault in the military, and so being aware of that and knowing how to respond to that. Of course, combat traumas and dealing with the traumas in combat, and also substance abuse and alcohol treatment are other areas that practitioners should be prepared to address when working with military people. And finally, just an indication that service members suffering from PTSD are more likely to become violent with their spouses. This is a key thing that's very important to keep in mind. Again, to kind of keep an eye on. And active duty personnel more likely than civilian family members to be involved in physical abuse, and the most frequent triggers for intimate partner violence among active duty personnel was marital discord and jealousy, which is very similar to any other kinds of relationship. But again, this relates more specifically to the military population. So that ties up the lecture for this week, and if you have any questions, please let me know. I hope that this material is something that's been useful to you, and as we wind down this semester, as you look to the future, I really am very hopeful that the content of this course is something that will give you a good foundation for working with families and being sensitive to the issues of child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, family violence, working with batterers and working with victims, and also adolescents as well. We really covered a lot of material this semester and a lot of data, but I hope that this pulls together in a meaningful way for you, that you can use it in your career in the years ahead. This is something that this information is going to keep changing, and I think the exciting thing about this particular part of the field is that we are really developing an awareness of how to intervene in these things. And so 40 or 50 years from now, I think, as you may get ready to retire, what we're doing with this field may look very different than it is today. But this is a good place for you to start. So it's been a pleasure for me to present this material to you this semester. I hope that it has been of use to you, and maybe we'll connect again at some other place in the future. So thanks again, and have a good break.